So the first thing I'm going to do is just give a demonstration on this device, and then I'm going to pass it around so you guys can try it out while I'm going through the talk. Obviously I have to mention, and this is just a very stern warning, if you have a history of seizures or if you are afraid, then it's okay. Basically, the device fits on your head, so you just kind of put it on. You want to try to aim the LEDs so that they're sort of right in front of your visual periphery. I'll turn them all on before I pass them around. So I'll explain what's happening. Basically, on this side, the LED is blinking at a certain frequency, and on this side it's blinking slightly slower than that. And so there's binaural audio going on and stroboscopic light with a differential that forces my mind to enjoy that a little bit. So I'm seeing things now. I'm seeing colors and shapes. There's kind of an interesting pattern developing on this side. And then I don't want to spend my whole time doing that. I could. It takes a while to experience the effect, about 10 seconds or so. After a half an hour, you literally are disembodied. You no longer experience the rest of your senses. As some of you may know, the vision occupies a huge part of our cognitive load. So in comparison to the other senses, it dominates. So what this does is it takes that over. And I'll go through describing it all, but for now I just want to pass this around. So I don't know if I can get a volunteer to start handing them. And I don't know how often we actually stop to think about what does it mean? What does it mean that we can see? What happens? What are we feeling when we see? You just take a moment and pick something that's close by. Maybe it's the fabric on the chair or somebody's hair nearby or your hand or something. And have a look at that. I just want to give us like 5 seconds, complete silence, look at something and perceive the feeling before we go on. Let's really consider what's happening. Consider that immense event. It's absolutely huge. So how do I even talk about it? I mean, I could take the bioneurological viewpoint, which would probably be not only well out of my expertise, but quite boring, and really we want to talk about art eventually. Of course, there's, the psychocognitive view, which is more aimed at basically semiotics, if you want to break it down to its essence. The physical view, we could look at just, what's happening in what's known as camera obscura, of course. Or we could look at the philosophical view, which doesn't really have to have a viewpoint at all, but it's really awesome to kind of think about things with respect to the meaning. But alas, an artist. So what does an artist do when trying to formulate a perception of the event that's occurring? I mean, obviously, the problem is that artists have this huge responsibility, and I don't know if we realize that, but we have to manifest something physically. That's incredible. We have to take it from our imagination and somehow make it tangible so that other people can experience even a fragment of what we have in our imagination. And that's a huge challenge, and it will always remain the case. And I don't know if we'll ever actually accomplish it. It's massive. So of course, it involves multiple viewpoints. That's not to say that one has to be an expert in any of the fields, but I think familiarizing ourselves with a variety of concepts helps us as artists to get a total picture conception, at least of the academics that's occurring. Whether or not we apply that to our final product at the end of the day is dependent on the vehicles and how we go about it, but it's important. It's important to know at least what is important to the other academics, though I don't necessarily distinguish between the viewpoints at the end of the day because it's a feeling. And that's exactly what I'm concerned with finding out. I mean, as an artist, I think we really are just concerned with feeling, and we don't give feeling a substantial weight in terms of something that's codifiable or measurable or and this is just seeing. Imagine someone tried to describe the feeling of love or something, which would be an awesome lecture, but you wouldn't be able to build a device to cause hallucinations, or maybe we are hallucinating when we're in love. But anyway, the feeling is what I'm seeking an answer to. So then the question becomes, what is the feeling of seeing? That is an immense question. That is not something that can be answered via some kind of scientific method. I'm not even sure it can be answered by a creative method. But I have found some things and I want to share them, like what I went through basically this far. And I'm totally receptive to continuing the exploration with any kind of ideas that come from you guys at the end of this thing. Good start, look at yourself. This is a well-documented situation. Lacan and the mirror phase, this is when you see yourself for the first time in the mirror. and you establish for yourself self-image. This is very well known. And from that point on, it becomes a part of the arsenal of your understanding of yourself. And as I mentioned in the slide, really where we end up at the end of the day is kind of where you start. So we'll talk about that, but it's in a less psychoanalytical perspective. Another way is to look at each other. Direct eye contact is this immense event. I mean, everyone in this room has experienced this. When you have eye contact with someone, especially maybe even in the case that you have a certain sentiment towards them, you can't describe that sensation. It's immense. It's like you're locked in their very existence. And what is that? I mean, let's just talk about it from the larger perspective instead of looking too far at codifying it. And of course, there's being looked at. Rupert Sheldrake is a sort of a pseudoscientist who has done a lot of studies into the sensation of being stared at. And he's actually managed to prove that it's real, it exists, and this is using the scientific method. His subjects were security personnel, military, people who spy on others, and they attest to the fact that the people who were being spied on could tell that they were being watched. I'm sure everyone in this room has had the sensation at one point or another. I feel like I'm being watched, and then you glance and you are being watched. What is that? I mean, these are immense ideas that haven't really been sort of broken down into their essential functions. But so just on the concept of being watched, and this is kind of an aside, but I thought I would throw it in there because there was all this discussion about surveillance that we've been going throughout the conference, and I think it's important. Of course, Michel Foucault is important to mention, the philosopher who did some work, and one of the central focuses of his studies was the panopticon, which is this prison that you see on your right-hand side, and the prison essentially is totally available to the security personnel who can spy on the prisoners at all times. And there's this kind of philosophy that Foucault builds, which is if you perceive that you're being surveilled, then you have an internalized mechanism of self-awareness. And he argues that that's a good system for governance, which I'm sure we're all experiencing right now in our various societies because we're being surveilled. But that was just an aside to describe the sensation of being stared at as a very key element to seeing. And now I say looking at someone else, looking at them while they look at you, these are things that might not seem intuitive when talking strictly about seeing, but I don't feel that seeing is exclusive of those ideas. It's a cycle. It's internalized, and I've proven it with an artwork, so we'll talk about that in a second. But seeing and being seen are, in my view, quite analogous. Now, what are they? Are they interdependent, interrelated? They're somehow connected, similar? I don't know. But the fact is that they remain in the same space, in the same ideological cycle. So try to imagine from this point on in the conversation when I'm saying seeing or when I'm saying being seen, really it's a cyclical process, and we'll get into the details of that. So the work that you're looking at was an artwork that I generated to explore this. And it was the first time that I'd made an artwork that I kind of had an idea in my mind what it should be like and actually quasi. So it's 32 human cast robotic faces and a face tracking system to track the movements of viewers in the gallery space. So you're confronted with this wall of eyes, which at first are closed. And eventually what happens is they open up and they start tracking you in the gallery space. From almost all users who participated in this, there's an instant sense of discomfort, which comes from this feeling as though the work is watching them. So if we just take a second to contemplate what that means, it's impossible. Nothing is watching them at all. Why do they feel like they're being watched? Well, the reason is because we technically spend most of the time watching ourselves. If you think about when you're being self-conscious about someone else having a look at you, really you're kind of looking at yourself through them. And so this is where I say vision is an outward and inward process. It's not something that you just project onto the world. I mean, I know that was like the original theories about vision, which was, we actually projected from our eyes, but they wanted to understand things in terms of touch, because it felt like you were touching something. Perhaps this will give you more interesting, intimate feelings when you make eye contact now or when you feel like you're being watched. So it's just something to consider. It proves basically we don't need someone to be watching us for us to feel like we're being watched. And a really important point needs to be made about, we talk about interactive art. And a couple of times there's been some descriptions as to exactly what that is and why it's problematic to use it in every case. But I really like to use the example of a ping pong game. And I'm really glad that we saw the example earlier with the machines playing ping pong. That was really awesome. So if you can imagine a ping pong game, okay, you're playing, anybody ping pong players? One, wow, you'd rock everybody else in the room. Tennis? Badminton? Nobody, no sports, okay. Well, you can imagine it, right? Which is awesome about being human. You don't actually have to have done it. So you're playing ping pong back and forth. But you can imagine, if you're just playing ping pong back and forth and responding to the way the ball comes to you, and really you're just acting upon another action, defined as reaction. There's no interaction at all. I think that in order for there to be interaction, it's like if you put a spin on the ball. If you do something intelligent, or perceived as, or enough to cause a kind of event which in some way adds to the formulation of this thing which happens in space-time, you're essentially adding to the interactive event, rather than it just simply being back and forth. And all of these different works that I'm describing have in one way or another an interactive element. So I just thought it was important to kind of cover that. So I also want to talk about the historical precedents for the work, because I think it's important for us to situate ourselves within whatever discourse has motivated us or pushed us forward. I don't know if anybody knows about Rosen's work, The Wooden Mirror. It's amazing. Basically, it's this wooden panel which is broken up into pixels, which are little wood chips. And they actuate up and down, and the light source from above causes there to be a grayscale image on a wooden surface. So obviously there's the pun about something being reflected on a wooden surface, but at the same time it is a reflexive event in a mediated experience of reflexivity, essentially, which I cover in just a moment. There's also Watched and Measured, Rokeby. This is about surveillance, but at the same time this notion of reflexivity, but the time scale is different. So he finds your head in video footage, and then when you enter into the gallery space, he shows you that you were being surveilled. Interestingly enough, a lot of people go back and forth like they want to be surveilled many times, and it's a game, and we've talked about how that's a strange and interesting thing. Sester's work, Access, it's really interesting actually, because in this case there's no sort of a direct mediated implication either by a video of yourself or a reflection of yourself, but we're dealing with a spotlight that highlights a person in a gallery space. And when you move around, that spotlight follows you around. And what's even more interesting is that she's got a website set up where people do the tracking. So there's this kind of event, or you're feeling as though you're being at least followed by a light at bare minimum. And maybe even if you go further than that, there can be more said about the reflexive event. Of course, any of these things I could elaborate on for quite a long time, but I'm trying to really narrow it down, so I hope I don't sound like a chicken with its head cut off talking really quickly. And probably the most direct example, Opto-Isolator, Levin Baltus, and this is a singular eye presented, and it does motion tracking as well. And it's interesting, when I came across this research and I was trying to decide how it should look, my first conception was just a wall of eyes. And what I realized is that there's a breaking point. You have to have a certain level of anthropomorphic representation in order to generate the sense of being stared at. In this case, I think Baltus fails in that there's a singular eye. And I've done some research. Maybe if there's any biologists in the room, they can correct me, but I've tried really hard to find it. There's no such thing as an animal with one eye. So we can't have this experience. And certainly there may be people with one eye, but not naturally. It's usually some occurrence. And now I want to talk about how new media is not the exclusive representation of reflexive events in when discussing reflexivity, of course. The most important, in my view, painting art historically, which cogitates the idea of reflexivity, is Las Meninas, of course. And from within this, we have looking, we have being looked at, we have looking inward, we have the multiplicities of looking. So really I think that this concept has been around for quite some time, and we're trying to explore and explain what is it to see, what is it to be seen, and what is it to represent what we see as artists. It's just the mediums have changed. So really I'll trace my lineage that far back, and I wish it could be further if there was some codified event to explain it. And this of course surrounds the notion of reflexivity, so that's seeing, being seen at the same time, as well as experiencing that event interpersonally as we go on. So here's the big question that I asked myself eventually is, I woke up from a really intense dream one night, and I said to myself, my eyes were closed the whole time. but I could see what was going on there. And so, you know, you could make arguments about memory, or you could make arguments about the way our cognitive processes work, but seriously, I was experiencing the visual event in a very visceral way, which was very similar to what I do when I'm awake, although it was, you know, obviously I was a little bit tripping out, so it's kind of funny how this is how it manifested in the form of an artwork. But can one actually see without having one's eyes open? So I did some research, and I came upon this artist, Brian Geisen, who, I just have to say for the record, I have no theoretical association with whatsoever, other than for for this particular resource, because he was a little bit floaty and very about the dimensions and about leaving this world and very sort of esoteric, crazy stuff. Well, anyway, interesting. But he managed to come up with this device he called the Dream Machine. And what it is basically is a record player, and he's got this tube shape on top of it with these forms cut out of it, and it spins around, and it causes you to hallucinate. Now, of course, he didn't just invent this out of anywhere. It actually, the story goes, is he was on a train, and he was sort of taking a nap up against the window, and there was sunlight shining through the window on his face, and the trees were going by at a certain rate, and he began to hallucinate. Now, for him, that might have been sort of normal, depending on what he was on for the day, but what he figured out is when you have this intermittent photic stimulation, he probably didn't describe it to himself that way at first, but you experience these hallucinatory events. Later on, you know, a gentleman like Mitch Altman, and this is an open source kit. Actually, if you guys want to build your own mind machine, I would advise going and get Mitch's kit, because it's really fun, and it's like probably €5, and it's really interesting. But he developed this kit where you could put a pair of safety goggles together with a POV kit. Persistence of vision is the kit, and you could experience these events. And so my contribution to that research is an augmented experience, where you can have these stereoscopic, stroboscopic audiovisual phenomena, which is, like I said, intermittent photic stimulation in the case of the lights. And you cause the viewer to go into this visual event. So what's basically happening is you're forcing the brain into a particular frequency. Now, we don't, as far as how the brain-mind paradigm works and all the questions that come up with that when dealing with this work, it's a very challenging thing to cover. But what we should consider is that when we sleep, our mind expresses certain frequencies, like the alpha range, for example. You might actually find, because I've set the device to the alpha range, that some of you are feeling sleepy, or that could just be it's the afternoon. So you have to ask yourself, why then are we experiencing this hallucinatory event? I would propose to everyone in this room that right now, you're actually hallucinating. Right now. But you have developed a way of making sense of that hallucination. So your visual event is actually that intense, but you've spent your entire life having it, so it doesn't feel that intense. And when I produce to you a device like this, which throws off only slightly the experience that you're having, it feels like totally whack and out of sync. All we're doing is kind of forcing the brain a little bit out of its normal patterns. The next steps in the research is to hook it up to an EEG device, because I think that really what we can accomplish with the different frequencies is mood changing. And if you go and research this online, you're going to find a lot of slapstick, awesome, you know, snake oil remedies to curing every psychological disease using these devices. But I think that if we had some kind of feedback loop, we could actually use it for a medium, an artistic medium. If we could control the hallucinations, we could actually use it to make artworks of all different kinds. And of course, what I presented is very crude. I mean, we're talking about a couple of LEDs that are flashing. Some ideas that I've had over time are perhaps it could be stimulated using motors that vibrate, in which case it would make an awesome product for the airplane, because you would just set your head back into it and you'd have the vibrations at different frequencies, and suddenly you're in the alpha range and you're sleeping. Awesome. Why go biofeedback loop in the first place? And I think my precedent would be people like Ducharme's. He gives a TED talk, and I don't know how many people watch TED, but really I advise it. It's liberating or destructive depending on your viewpoint. But he gives this talk about chronic pain patients. Okay, so he deals with these chronic pain patients, and he shows them the pain that's occurring in real time in fMRI so they can see it happening on a screen. And then he just tells them, will it away. Will it away. God. Just like that. And he's found a 40% success rate in this. Incredible. So people overcome their pain simply by being aware of where it occurs in their brain. They couldn't have done that on their own time and just kind of will your pain away. It's a chronic pain condition. It's a very serious condition. So how is that possible? I mean, we really have to ask these questions. I know I've asked a lot of them, and they're kind of, you know, outside of the realm of codification or maybe inquiry as it currently stands, or maybe we just need more inquiry into it. But I think that if we have interactivity, but we also have a kind of a feedback loop within our media practices, we have the capacity to enhance the total perceptive abilities of the viewer. I mean, that's really the case, just like the mirror image that we first witnessed. If that is true, that enhances our perceptive capacity, then why is it not possible for art to enhance the perceptive capacity of the viewer? And I totally believe that's possible, and there's precedence for it, which I've demonstrated. Thank you.